The frost came early to Kelston that year. By the third week of the harvest month, the mud in the market lane had gone hard as iron, and the water barrel outside the cooperage wore a skin of ice each morning before the sun had fully climbed. The townspeople learned to read the sky as they always did the color of the clouds at dusk, the way the wind moved through the high spruce on the ridge, and by those signs they judged that winter meant to arrive ahead of schedule and stay longer than welcome. They pulled in their stores, chinked their window frames with old rags and pine pitch, and drew their doors a little tighter against strangers than they usually did, which was already tight enough. The town of Kelston had never been large. 140 souls, give or take a seasonal hand or two, arranged along a single market lane with the roads running north and east like the arms of a tired man holding out his hands. There was an inn, a dry goods store, a cooperage, a smithy, a bakery, a carpenter's shop, a small mill on the creek a quarter-mile east, and at the lane's midpoint the magistrate's hall, which was also where you went if you had a disputed property line, a missing animal to report, or a form to fill for any of the official purposes that the frontier charter required forms to be filled for. The hall was, in this way, the hinge of the town, the place that documented what Kelston was and who was in it, even if most residents went there no more than once or twice in a decade. It was into this particular frost, on a Tuesday morning when the market lane was nearly empty, and most sensible people were inside with their fires banked high, that the Orc woman walked through Kelston's north gate. She was taller than most men by half a head and broader at the shoulder than any of them. Her skin was a deep, earthy green, the color of moss on a river stone in midsummer, and her tusks, two of them, curved upward and worn smooth with age, caught the pale morning light. Her hair was black and long, pulled back in a plain traveling braid that had a few strands of silver in it, which put her age somewhere past 40, though it was difficult to be more precise. She wore a cloak that had been good wool once, perhaps years ago. Now it was mended at the collar and both cuffs, and had faded to a color that was not quite brown and not quite gray. Slung over one shoulder was a large leather satchel, worn soft with long use, its brass clasps gone green with the kind of verdigris that accumulates over decades. She was not armed. She was not running. She walked with a steady, unhurried pace, her boots leaving clean prints in the frost-hardened lane, and she looked straight ahead. She stopped at the inn first. The innkeeper, a man named Prosser, took one look at her through the half-open door and said, "No room," with the brisk finality of a man who has anticipated this exact conversation and prepared his end of it in advance. He shut the door. She stood on the step for a moment, not angry, just still, in the way of someone who has been given information they already expected, and then stepped down into the lane and walked toward the market square. She tried the dry goods store next. Edna Murch kept 2 rooms above her storeroom and sometimes let them to travelers in need. There was a small hand-painted sign in the window to this effect, faded but legible. Edna looked up from her counter when the bell above the door sounded, saw who had come in, and said she was full up. She wasn't. The room above the storeroom had been empty since the miller's son had taken his leave in the spring, and the key still hung on the hook by Edna's elbow, plain as the nose on her face. But Edna looked at the key, and then at the Orc woman, and then back at her ledger without meeting anyone's eyes. The Orc woman did not argue. She looked at the key hook for a moment, long enough that Edna's ears went red, and then she turned and went back out into the cold. In the market square, 3 people crossed the lane to avoid passing near her. One small boy stared openly from behind a wagon wheel, the frank, unself-conscious stare of a child who has not yet been taught that staring is rude, until his mother appeared around the corner of the cooperage, saw what he was staring at, and pulled him away with a haste that was itself a comment. An old man walking with a stick changed his course without quite looking up. The woman at the bread stall, seeing the direction she was walking, developed a sudden urgent interest in the arrangement of her loaves. The Orc woman watched all of this, Then she turned and walked toward the magistrate's hall. The magistrate's hall in Kelston was not a grand building. It was 2 rooms, a records room and a public room, with a cast-iron stove that kept the public room warm for the 6 hours a day it was needed, and cold as a root cellar the rest of the time. It smelled of old paper and wood ash, and the particular sharpness of iron gall ink that never quite leaves walls that have absorbed it for 40 years. There was a desk, a bench for visitors, 3 high shelves crammed with ledger books and case files in various states of organization, and a wooden placard on the wall that listed, in faded letters, the legal obligations of any traveler passing through Kelston under the terms of the Frontier Charter of 237, among which was the requirement that any traveler who intended to stay more than 3 nights register their name and purpose with the sitting magistrate. Aldous Crane had been the sitting magistrate for 19 years. He was 64 years old. He had a narrow face, gray at the temples and clean-shaved, with a habit of looking at the person across his desk, the way a man looks at a piece of text he is genuinely trying to read rather than merely scan. His wife had died 11 years ago, a long illness, a slow going, and he had held her hand through most of it. He had 1 grown daughter who lived in the capital and wrote him letters every month, cheerful letters full of her children's doings and the small dramas of her neighborhood, letters he read on Sunday evenings with the cedar box open on the table and a cup of tea going cold beside him. He was, by the reckoning of most of Kelston, a fair man, a thorough man and a quiet one, in roughly that order of local importance. He was at his desk recording a boundary dispute between 2 neighbors, the 3rd attempt to resolve it. This one was going marginally better than the first 2, when the Orc woman came through his door. He looked up. He took her in the full height of her, the worn cloak, the heavy satchel, the quality of her stillness, and held her gaze for a moment without any expression on his face. Then he set down his pen. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. "You've come to register." "I was told I need to, if I'm staying more than 3 nights." "That's right." He pulled a fresh intake form from the top drawer of his desk and set it on the surface between them. He uncapped the ink bottle and squared the form the way a man squares a thing when he means to take it seriously. "Name." She hesitated not long, just a beat, the kind of brief pause a person makes when deciding which name to give. "Vara," she said, "traveling healer." "No fixed address." He wrote it down exactly as she had given it in his careful, even script. He asked her the questions required by the form: point of origin, last registered town, intended duration of stay, nature of business, and she answered each one plainly and without elaboration. She had come from the eastern valleys. She had registered in Durnmere 3 weeks ago. She expected to stay through the winter if she could find suitable board. She did not say where she had been before Durnmere, and the form did not ask. He wrote all of it down. Then he capped the ink bottle and looked at the form for a moment. "You've tried Prosser's," he said. "It wasn't really a question." "Yes." "And Murch?" A pause. "Yes." He stood up from his desk, requiring, as he always did, a careful push against the chair, which had a tendency to catch on the uneven floorboards, and went to the 3rd shelf. He pulled out a thin ledger with a green cloth cover, the one he kept for boarding house registrations and obligations. He opened it and ran his finger down a column until he found the entry he was looking for. "There's a woman named Hartley on the South Lane," he said, without looking up from the ledger. "She keeps 2 rooms for boarders. By the terms of the Frontier Charter, any registered boarding establishment is obligated to accommodate any traveler who presents themselves with good coin and no current outstanding warrant, which you don't have as of this morning's records." He wrote an address on a slip of paper, tore it cleanly from the corner of the page, and held it across the desk. "Tell her Crane sent you and cite the charter. She'll know what that means." Vara took the slip of paper. She looked at it, then looked at him. "Thank you," she said. not effusively, just directly, the way a person says a thing they mean without needing to dress it up. "Your file will stay open until you register a departure," he said, sitting back down with the care his chair required. "If you need anything official, a letter of recommendation, a dispute arbitrated, a complaint lodged, the hall is open weekday mornings, 6 to noon." She nodded once, turned, and left. He heard her boots on the step, then the silence of the cold lane outside. He picked up his pen and returned to the boundary dispute. Outside, the north wind picked up and rattled the loose shutter above the window. He pulled the oil lamp a little closer and went on writing. He did not see her again for 11 days. The winter moved in fast and hard, as the signs had said it would. By the end of the first month, the roads out of Kelston were mostly impassable. The east road first, then the north, then the cart track to the mill, and the town settled into the close, layered life it kept between the first heavy snow and the first spring thaw. A life of fires banked to last the night, of rationed stores and the low murmur of people who had been in each other's company too long and were managing it, more or less, with the patience of people who had nowhere else to be. The illness came in the second month. It came the way illness usually came to a cold, crowded town, first one family, then the family across the lane, then the baker's apprentice, and then the baker himself, and then the baker's wife. It was a fever and lung complaint, nothing unusual for the season, the kind that every winter in the valleys produced in some form. But this year it moved fast, and it was hard on the old and the very young. And the town's physician, a man named Gelb who had served Kelston for 15 years and was generally well regarded, had gone to tend his sister's family in Durnmere just before the roads closed and had not made it back. His assistant, a young woman named Pell who had been trained under him for 3 years and knew considerably more than she let on, was doing what she could, and she could do quite a lot, but she was one person. The illness was spreading through 10 households, and the kind of care that required sitting with a patient through the night could only be divided so many ways. Aldous knew about all of this, because it was his business to know such things. He kept a record of registered complaints and official requests. He wrote to the county seat when the last rider went out before the roads closed entirely, requesting a physician be sent when the roads opened. The county seat sent back a letter of sympathy and an assurance that assistance would come when travel was possible. He arranged for 2 able-bodied men to carry firewood to households that were too sick to fetch it themselves. He checked on old Moss Rook himself, twice a week, because Rook was 71 and lived alone and had been coughing since the first cold snap. He did what a magistrate could do, which was not the same as what a physician could do, and he knew the difference. On a Wednesday morning in the middle of that second month, a man named Culloch came to the hall and said he needed to lodge a complaint. He was a broad, red-faced man who farmed the North Field and held opinions about most things, and he wore his complaint like a man wearing a coat he was not quite comfortable in. "It's that Orc woman," he said, "Hartley's boarder." "What about her?" "She went into the Wren house last night, without being asked." Aldous looked at him. How did she come to be at the Wren house? Culloch shifted his weight. "The Wren boy, the younger one, he's had the fever 3 days running. His mother's been at her rope's end. She was out at the pump yesterday afternoon, and apparently she was crying, just standing there in the cold crying because she didn't know what else to do, and the Orc woman was passing by on the lane and saw her." He stopped. "She asked if she could help. That's what the Wren woman says. Asked plain, no pushing." "And Mistress Wren said yes," Aldous said. "She did, because she was exhausted and the boy was bad and she didn't know what else to do." Culloch said this in the tone of a man laying out evidence that, he was dimly aware, may not be supporting his original position. "The Orc woman went in and stayed 4 hours, and apparently the boy's fever broke this morning, which I grant you is good, but it doesn't sit right with me. An unregistered healer going into people's homes." "She is registered," Aldous said. He went to the shelf, pulled Vara's file and set it on the desk. Registered healer, traveling. As of the first morning she arrived in town. He turned the form to face Kullik. There is no statute in the charter or in the county ordinances requiring a registered traveling healer to obtain permission from anyone other than the householder before rendering care to a consenting adult. Mistress Wren consented. Kullik looked at the file with the expression of a man who has brought a larger stone to a fight than he realizes and is reconsidering his grip. "It's not about the statute," he said. "It's about not knowing who she is, or what she's putting in these remedies." "Her file is here if you want to review it," Aldous said. "And if the Wren boy is better this morning, I'd say what she put in the remedies was something useful." He capped the ink bottle he had been absently holding since Kullik walked in. "Is there anything you want me to record formally?" Kullik looked at the file, he looked at Aldous, he looked at the window. "No," he said at length. "No, I suppose not." He left without a formal complaint filed, and Aldous returned the file to the shelf. He held his pen over the boundary dispute that had been waiting 3 weeks for his final signature. Then he set it down, put on his coat, and walked out into the cold. He found her at the Rook house, 3 doors down the south lane from the Wren house. Old Moss Rook had been coughing for 10 days with the kind of wet, rattling quality that winter coughs sometimes took on in men of his age. The kind that started as an ordinary cold and became something with more weight to it. Aldous had visited twice this week and found nothing he could do except ensure the fire was kept up and the old man had food. Now, stepping through the door into Rook's small house, he found it transformed. The fire was high, higher than the old man ever kept it himself, because he was careful of his wood. The window was open a 1/4 inch, which should have made it colder but somehow made it feel cleaner. On the windowsill sat a small clay pot containing something that smelled of pine resin and a sharper herb he could not name. The smell was both medicinal and, surprisingly, pleasant. And Rook himself was asleep in his chair with the slow, deep regularity of someone getting real rest for the first time in days. Vara was sitting on a low stool beside him. She looked up when Aldous came in and held a finger to her lips. Rook was truly asleep, she meant, not just dozing. He came quietly and stood near the fire, and after a moment she stood too, moved the clay pot carefully from the windowsill, and led him back toward the door. "How is he?" Aldous asked, keeping his voice low. "Better than yesterday. The chest is beginning to clear." She capped a small glass bottle she had been holding and put it in her satchel. "He needs to stay warm and keep off his feet for another 4 days at minimum, and someone should be making sure he drinks the tea twice daily. I've written the recipe on the inside cover of the notebook on his table." "I'll make sure of it." He looked at the clay pot in her hands. "What is that, the one in the window?" "Spruce resin, juniper berries, dried thyme, and a small amount of ground willow bark, simmered slow. The steam opens the breathing passages when a person's been coughing long enough for the chest to tighten. Nothing that would surprise a well-trained physician." She tucked the pot into a protective wrapping in the satchel. "It should surprise anyone who's been telling you. There's nothing to be done for a chest cough." He looked at her. "Are you here about the Kullik complaint?" she asked. He considered the question. "I'm here to check on Moss Rook," he said, "and to let you know that you are not in any trouble." "I know I'm not," she said. Not arrogantly, just in the direct, confirming way of someone who has looked at the question and arrived at a clear answer. "But you came to tell me anyway." "I did." She studied him for a moment with that quality of attention he had noticed the first morning, careful, not unfriendly, neither sizing him up nor performing interest, just actually looking. Then she picked up her satchel. "Walk with me," she said. "I have 3 more calls to make before noon, and it will go faster with someone who knows which house is which." He walked with her. It became a pattern, without either of them deciding it would be. Tuesdays and Fridays, roughly, not every week, but more often than not, he walked with her on her rounds. When the snow was deep and the lanes drifted badly, she let him carry the satchel on the worst stretches, handing it over without comment, taking it back the same way when the footing improved. She explained what she was doing as she did it, in the clear, unhurried way of someone for whom explanation has become second nature, the way a teacher explains, or the way a person explains who has spent long years in rooms where skepticism was the default and thoroughness was the only answer to it. He listened. When he did not understand something, he said so. She seemed to find this more useful than the alternative, and adjusted her explanations accordingly without any trace of condescension. He learned, over those weeks, that her knowledge of plant medicines went far deeper than anything he had encountered in the frontier medical tradition. He had read Gelb's reference texts, not thoroughly, but enough to recognize the vocabulary, and what Vara knew was in conversation with those texts at some points, and entirely beyond them at others. She knew the deep pharmacopoeia of the Green Ash clan's healing lineage, which she told him had been built up and refined over several centuries, cross-referenced against seasonal and regional variation in ways that the human frontier medicine had not had time to develop. She knew how particular compounds interacted with cold weather ailments in ways that Gelb, who was a good physician with a practical intelligence, had never recorded in his case notes. She knew the structural reason. She explained it once, walking between the Rook House and the Murch House, with the snow falling lightly and her breath white on the air. Why certain root medicines worked better in the first week of an illness and differently in the third, and the explanation was logical and specific, and when he thought about it afterward, obvious in the way that things are obvious once someone with the right framework has given them to you. Her hands were a healer's hands. He noticed this in the way he noticed things thoroughly, without making a production of it, practiced and unhurried, gentle with the sick in the particular way that only comes from having done this kind of work many hundreds of times. She moved through an assessment fast, because she had done it thousands of times and could read the relevant indicators quickly, but she did not make her patients feel rushed. She had a way of sitting at a bedside, slightly turned toward the patient, not looming, not performing reassurance, that seemed to communicate that she had nowhere else to be and nothing she would rather be doing than attending to this person specifically, which was either a very good performance or simply true. He came to believe it was true. She had a clean, practical calm about sickness that he recognized as the opposite of coldness. He had seen the same quality in his wife at the end, when his wife had been clear-eyed about her own condition in a way that he had not yet been able to match. Attentiveness without flinching, the ability to stay present with suffering without being submerged by it or defended against it. By the third month, 11 people in Kelston had her to thank for a part of their recovery. The town had begun to notice. The noticing was complicated. You cannot easily maintain a certain kind of wariness about a person when she has sat at your mother's bedside for 4 hours, and the old woman is breathing freely by morning. The wariness did not entirely disappear. It is the nature of some fears that they are not cleanly overwritten, but only slowly overlaid with other, newer experiences. But it changed shape. Edna Murch said nothing directly. She left a small cloth parcel at the boarding house door one morning, dried currants, still on the stem, with a note that said only in her angular handwriting, "Thank you." She did not say thank you for what. She did not need to. The baker's wife began adding an extra roll to Vara's morning order without being asked. She did this in the Kelston manner, which was to not mention it, and to look at the wall if anyone remarked upon it, but to keep doing it. The Wren woman stopped crossing the lane when she saw Vara coming and started, instead, crossing toward her. The younger boy, the one whose fever had broken, developed the habit of offering his hand to be shaken each time, with the grave formality of a small child practicing an adult ceremony. Vara shook it every time with an equivalent gravity. Aldous watched all of this. He was aware that something was shifting in himself as well, and he catalogued it with the same honesty he applied to his official records. He had admired competence all his life. the pleasure of watching someone do a thing well, whether it was laying a stone wall or adjudicating a property dispute or reducing a dangerous fever with 3 carefully chosen ingredients. He had not expected, at 64, to find himself looking forward to Tuesday and Friday mornings with the particular anticipation of a man who has rediscovered something he did not know he missed. The conversation was part of it. The quality of her mind, systematic and empirical and humane together, was unlike anything he had routinely had access to in Kelston, which was not a slight to Kelston, but a simple fact about a town of 140 people in a frost-bound valley. The walk itself was part of it too. He had spent 11 years walking alone and had convinced himself this was entirely sufficient. On a Tuesday morning in the deep cold of the 3rd month, he built up the fire in the hall past his usual level of economy and set a second chair beside the stove. He had done this before, on evenings when the cold outside was cruel enough that it seemed unkind to let a visitor stand in a half-warm room. On this particular Tuesday he had, the previous morning, asked if she would stop by in the evening on her way back from the Murch household at the end of the lane. She came at 7:30. He made tea from the small kettle on the back shelf, a pine and dried berry brew from the recipe she had spread freely through the town, and they sat by the stove and talked first about the Murch boy, who had had a setback, and what the best course was for the next week. The Murch boy was handled in the first quarter of an hour, and they stayed by the stove for another 2 after that. He could not have said, afterward, exactly how the conversation moved from the Murch boy's lungs to the history of the Green Ash clan's healing tradition, or from there to the question of how the knowledge had been preserved and transmitted across generations despite the disruption of the frontier settlements, or from there to the more pointed question of why that knowledge was not more widely shared across the valley towns when the towns needed it so badly, and the knowledge was, in geographic terms, sitting on their doorstep. She spoke about these things with a precision that continued to tell him things he filed carefully for later consideration. The detail of her knowledge of the clan settlements in the eastern valleys, their organizational structure, their resources, the political relationships between the Green Ash clan and the neighboring clans, the names and locations of settlements she cited with the confidence of someone who had visited them recently and often, was not the knowledge of a traveling healer who had passed through now and then. It was the knowledge of someone who had spent years in those settlements in a position of some weight. He noted this without remarking on it. At one point, looking into the fire, she said, "The problem has always been that the knowledge exchange requires trust, and trust requires someone on the human side who is willing to be visibly in relationship with someone from our side. Not tolerating it quietly, willing to be seen doing it, and frontier towns are not, on average, good at producing that person." He held his tea and looked at her. "You've given this considerable thought," he said. She glanced up. Something shifted in her expression, a small adjustment, like a door that had been open a crack sliding a little further. "For a long time," she said. He let the silence sit for a moment, which was something he had become comfortable doing in her company over the winter. The kind of silence that is productive rather than awkward, the kind that occurs between people who are not performing for each other. "How long have you been a healer?" he asked. She looked into her mug. "Since I was 15, I was apprenticed to my mother. She was the clan's first healer before me." He kept his voice even. "Before you." A pause, yes. He did not press. He had 19 years of practice at recognizing the moment when pressing would close something that was opening of its own accord. He reached for the ink bottle he had left on the side table and uncapped it and made a brief notation in the margin of the file he had open in front of him, a routine procedural note, nothing related to what she had just said. He was aware of her watching him do it. "Your file," she said, "you've been adding to it." Routine. All open cases are updated when there's relevant new information. What kind of new information? Observations, In your case, things like confirmed practicing healer 3 months. 11 resident cases treated, all outcomes positive or improved. No complaints upheld. That kind of notation. He capped the ink bottle. The sort of thing that accumulates in any file that stayed open for a season. She was quiet for a moment. Do you do that for everyone? For the cases that warrant it, he said, which is more often than people seem to expect. He set the file aside. Drink your tea before it goes cold. She looked at him for a moment longer, that quality of reading attention, and then she smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile in the unguarded way, not the brief curve she gave the Wren boy when he offered his hand, but something that came from the inside out, a quiet illumination that moved through her whole face and made her look briefly younger and more open. He noted it the way he noted everything, quietly, and let it be what it was. She drank her tea. By the 4th month, the worst of the illness had passed through Kelston. It had not taken anyone, a fact that Pell, the assistant physician, attributed to the cold weather and good timing, and that Aldous attributed in part to other factors he had documented in several updated files. The town was not warm toward Vara in the way a town can be warm when the thawing weather comes, and everyone is feeling generous. Warmth was perhaps too strong a word for what Kelston, as a collective, was capable of generating toward someone it had spent months not being sure how to look at. But it was something. The Wren family's younger boy had taken to making a small ceremony of returning library books. The town kept a shelf of lending books in the hall, a tradition Aldous had started a decade ago, and he now always had a message from his mother for Vara when she came in on official business, even when there was no obvious occasion for such a message. Old Rook had fully recovered. He came to the hall one morning in the 4th month with a small carved wooden box, roughly made with considerable care, that he set on Aldous' desk without explanation and departed. The box held dried herbs in separate small cloth bags, each one labeled in Old Rook's crabbed handwriting. Aldous recognized, on inspection, that they were the herbs from Vara's winter tea recipes. He understood, having known Rook for 19 years, that the box was not for him. He held it, looking at the labels. He was aware, holding it, that he was going to have to say something eventually that did not fit inside the language he usually used for the things he thought. He set this observation in a file in the part of his mind that he kept for things he intended to address when he had found the right shape for them, and went on with his morning. On a Friday evening late in the 4th month, he asked again if she would stop by after her last call. He had bread and salt fish, and a broth from the remains of a chicken one of the neighboring farms had sent over. It was not much, but it was more than one person needed, and the hall was warm. She stayed again, and they ate at the small table in the records room, and she asked about the cedar box on the shelf behind him, his daughter's letters, and he told her about his daughter, who was sharp and funny, and had married a man he liked and now had 2 boys of her own. She said she had a sister in the western settlements who wrote when the writers were going that way. He said he hoped that was often. She said, with a small rueful quality, not often enough. It was very ordinary. It was, he thought, the most ordinary thing that had happened in the magistrate's hall in a long time. He found it nourishing in the specific, quiet way that ordinary things are nourishing when you have been without them long enough to have forgotten you were missing something. The snow began to melt in the 5th month. The first meltwater came down off the ridge on a Thursday morning, threading through the frozen mud in thin, clear lines, and the children ran out to watch it with the wondering attention children give to water moving, as though it were always a small miracle that the world could go from frozen to flowing again. The roads were still a week or more from fully passable, but the quality of the light changed. The days were longer, and the sun came in at a different angle through the hall's south window, laying a stripe of warmth across the desk that had not been there since autumn. Everyone in Kelston felt it. The loosening, the first breath of something that was not entirely winter. It was in this first week of thaw, on a Monday morning when Aldous had a full desk and was working through it steadily, that the rider came. He came from the east, on a tall roan horse with the lean, capable build of an animal bred for distance over speed. He was an orc, young, perhaps 25, with a green clan rider's sash worn crossed over his chest and a leather message case secured at his hip. He stopped at the north gate and asked a woman passing by for the magistrate's hall, and was pointed down the lane, and came through Aldous's door a few minutes later with his riding gloves in one hand and the message case in the other. He produced from the case a sealed letter and held it out. The seal was green wax, pressed with a stamp that showed a stylized ash tree inside a circle. The clan seal of the green ash, the same mark Aldous had seen on official correspondence from the county seat when dealing with treaty and boundary matters involving the clan settlements in the eastern valleys. For the honored healer Vara, the writer said. He set the letter on the desk with the deliberate care of someone who has been given specific instructions about how to handle a particular piece of correspondence. We were told at Durnmere that she registered here. We were told the magistrate would know where to find her. Aldous looked at the letter. He looked at the seal. He read the inscription on the front, which was written in two scripts side by side, common script on the left and clan script on the right, the two columns even and careful. In the common script it read, "To the honored healer Vara of the Green Ash clan, first among healers, keeper of the old remedies, daughter of the matriarch Sura." He held his face where it was, 19 years of practice. "I know where to find her," he said. He carried the letter himself. He did not send the rider, not because he was being proprietary about his messenger duties, but because he wanted the walk, which was 3 minutes long and gave him approximately 3 minutes of useful thinking time. The lane was bright with meltwater, and the mud had just started to soften. He walked it looking straight ahead. He had known, of course. He had not known the title specifically, but he had known for some time that the woman in the boarding house at the end of the South Lane was not a traveling healer in the ordinary sense of the word. The depth of her knowledge was one thing, the depth and specificity and organization of it, a lifetime of serious work. The fluency with which she described the clan settlements was another, the fluency of long and consequential familiarity, not a traveler's passing knowledge. The quality of authority in the way she addressed systemic problems, the vocabulary of someone who had not just observed a situation, but had been responsible for decisions within it. The things she had said by the stove on those Friday evenings, about knowledge exchange and trust, and the difficulty of finding the right person on the human side. The way she had said before me. He had known. He had simply left the file open, the way you leave a window open on a morning when the light is coming, but the day is not yet fully revealed, because some things clarify better when they are allowed to arrive in their own time. First among healers, keeper of the old remedies, daughter of the matriarch. He thought about 11 people in Kelston who were fully recovered because she had knocked on their doors in the hard cold of February. He thought about the recipe in every kitchen on the lane. He thought about Rook's carved box on his desk. He thought about the quality of sitting beside the stove in the evenings, and having the particular conversation that comes from two people who are both trying honestly to think about something. He thought about the file that had accumulated over a winter's worth of Tuesday and Friday mornings, and contained, now, more careful observation than he had entered into any file in recent memory. He knocked at the boarding house door. Hartley let him in without comment. She had long since reached the point of not requiring explanation for his visits, which itself said something about how the winter had shifted things. He went upstairs and knocked at the room door. Vara opened it. She was in her traveling cloak, which made sense because the room was cold and it was the warmest thing she owned, and her satchel was on the table with several items out of it. She had been going through it, organizing, the way you organize things before a departure. She looked at the letter in his hand and went still. He held it out. She took it, turned it over once to look at the seal, and looked up at him. In her expression was something he had not seen before, not distress, but the look of someone who has been carrying something unsaid for a long time and can see clearly that the season of carrying it has ended. "Sit down," he said. "I'll wait." She sat on the edge of the bed and opened the letter. He took the wooden chair by the window and looked out at the south lane, where a gray cat was picking its careful way along the top of a low stone wall in the last of the mud and snow. He listened to the sound of the paper in her hands, her breathing, controlled and steady, and then after a moment a small sound that was not quite a word. Then silence. "My mother is ill," she said. "I'm sorry," he said. "She's been ill since the autumn. They waited to send word because—" She stopped, started again. "I have been gone longer than I planned, longer than any of us planned. The winter closed the roads before anyone expected." He turned from the window. She was looking at the letter, not at him. Her face was composed the way you compose a face when you are working at it. "You'll need to go," he said. "Yes." "When?" "Tomorrow, if the east road is passable." "It opened this morning." She nodded once, looking at the letter. Then she looked up at him. "I should have told you," she said. "At the beginning, when I came to register, I should have given you my full title." "You gave me your name," he said. "Vara, was that not your name?" "It's my name." "Then the file is accurate." He paused. "I may have omitted some things." A silence. Then the small interior illumination moved across her face briefly and then composed again. "You're a strange man, Aldous Crane," she said, "for a magistrate." "I've been told that," he said, "generally as a complaint." She folded the letter and put it inside her cloak. She stood and began packing the satchel with the systematic efficiency of someone who has done this in a hurry more times than she could count. He stood as well and moved toward the door. "The Murch boy," she said, not turning. "His cough will come back with the wet weather. The dried time preparation is in the file. I wrote it in 3 weeks ago. Make sure whoever's tending him knows to use dried, not fresh. The fresh doesn't concentrate potently enough in this climate." "I'll see to it." "And Rook, no outdoor exposure before the 6th week of thaw. His lungs are still rebuilding. He'll want to get out as soon as it looks like spring, and he needs someone to tell him not yet." "I'll tell him." She turned then, satchel over her shoulder, and looked at him across the room. The morning light was coming in from the east window and she was standing in it, and she looked exactly as she had the first morning she had come to his desk. The same bearing, the same quality of self-possession, and also entirely different in a way he did not try to put in words. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he said. She considered this. "For the file," she said, "and for the chair." He nodded. He wanted to say something more and did not say it, because it had not yet arrived in a shape he could give correctly. He nodded again, once, and left. She was gone before he reached the hall. 3 weeks passed. The roads opened fully, and the town stirred back to life the way it always did after a hard winter, tentatively at first, then with increasing energy, like a fire that's been damped down for months taking on fresh air. Gelb came back from Durnmere, thinner and tired, and with a bad cough of his own that had the quality of a physician who had been working through his own illness for weeks without stopping. He set up his practice again in the house on the square and began working through the backlog. He found, going through the cases he had missed, a set of notes written in a clear, careful hand that covered every sick call in Kelston from midwinter through the 4th month, 43 entries, each one organized by date, patient name, presenting symptoms, proposed cause, treatment employed, dosage and preparation details, and outcome. The notes were thorough in the way that records kept by someone with long institutional experience are thorough. Not just the facts, but the reasoning connecting them, the alternative explanations considered and ruled out, the notation of which treatments had been modified from the standard preparation, and why. Gelb read them in the way he read things he intended to understand, not just skim. He spent a full afternoon with them. He found in the records of the 11 fever and lung cases a set of compound preparations he had never seen, with a logical basis he could follow, and that, looking at the outcomes, clearly worked. He found in the notes for Old Rook's case a detailed analysis of the progression of a chest complaint in a patient of advanced age that was more precisely calibrated than anything in his reference texts. He knocked on Aldis's door the following morning. "These case notes," he said, setting the folder on the desk. "The ones for my missing months, who kept them?" "Her name is Vara," Aldis said. "Green Ash Clan. She registered as a traveling healer in the autumn." Gelb looked at him for a moment, and her actual standing. "First among healers," Aldis said. "I found that out when the clan letter arrived." A pause. Gelb sat down without being invited, which was unusual for him. He was a formal man in his professional habits. "The tincture she used for the severe lung cases," he said. "The one with the compound she calls mountain sorrel and the ratio with the willow bark. I've never seen that preparation. I'd like to understand it." "That seems entirely reasonable," Aldis said. "Is she coming back?" Aldis looked out the window at the lane. The market was opening up again, the stalls going up, the carts coming in from the farms outside town, the sounds of a market lane finding its spring voice. "I don't know," he said, which was the honest answer. He did not close the file. On the 23rd day after she left, a Thursday morning with a clear pale spring sky, and the creek running audible from the hall window for the first time in months, a rider came through the east gate, and then another behind the first, and then 3 more, and behind them 2 wagons with canvas covers, their wheels throwing mud, and a third wagon open-bedded and loaded with what appeared, from a distance, to be timber and dressed stone. And behind the wagons, on foot and on horseback, came a delegation of 27. They were Green Ash Clan, healers and apprentices, by their sashes and their satchels, the green and gray of the clan colors, several of them, and the ash tree mark in silver embroidery on the senior sashes. They came in with a calm, purposeful order, not crowding the gate, not pushing. At the front of the delegation, riding a gray horse, was Vara. She was wearing her traveling clothes, the same plain, worn cloak, but over them she wore the senior healer's sash in the clan colors, deeply green and ash gray, with the tree embroidered in silver thread, and it sat on her shoulders with the settled, natural weight of something worn for 25 years. She looked the same and entirely different. She looked like herself. Aldis thought, like the person she had been all winter and could not fully show. The 27 healers and apprentices behind her rode in the kind of formation that made it evident, without announcement, that they were following her. Kelston came out. They came out the way Kelston came out for things, a few at first, then more, then most. Prosser appeared at the inn door. Edna Murch stood at the front of her store with her arms crossed over her apron, watching. The Wren woman was there at the edge of the square with the younger boy on her hip, the boy craning to see. The baker stood at the corner with his wife. Old Rook was there. Someone had helped him into his coat and out the door, standing with his neighbor and watching with the deliberate attention of a man who intends to miss nothing. Even Kullik was in the square at the back, not saying anything. Vara stopped her horse in the middle of the square. She looked at the town, the lane, the faces, the market stalls half set up, the ring of people around the square. She looked at it steadily for a moment. Then she looked at the magistrate's hall, and at Aldis, who was standing in the doorway with his coat half on because he had heard the sound from the lane and come out before he had finished putting it on properly. She swung down from the horse. She walked across the square toward him. She stopped a few feet away and looked at him with that same direct, reading quality. Only this time it had a different quality to it, something that was less assessment and more recognition, as though she had come back to a place she had been thinking about. "I told my mother about Kelston," she said, "about the winter, about the 11 cases and how the town managed the illness with one assistant physician and no road out. She paused. I told her about the chair by the stove and the file that stayed open. He waited. The Green Ash clan has wanted to establish a healing post in the western frontier towns for 40 years, she said. It has never happened because neither side could find the right starting place. She glanced back at the wagon loaded with stone and timber. The materials in that third wagon are a gift from the clan to Kelston. A proper healer's hall, not a boarding room and a borrowed windowsill. We will help build it. She looked back at him. The delegation behind me will stay the summer to build the hall and begin the knowledge exchange, the combined protocols, the shared remedies, the training for your physician and his assistant. After that, 2 of us will remain permanently. He looked at her. He looked at the 27 behind her. He looked at the wagon of stone. 2, he said. Myself, she said, and an apprentice. She held his gaze. If the town will have me. The square was very quiet. 27 healers sat on their horses and on foot behind her. The baker's wife had the bread she was wrapping still in her hands. Old Rook was leaning slightly forward, his good ear turned toward the front of the square. The Wren boy had stopped fidgeting and was watching with his particular solemn attention, and one of his small hands was pressed against his mother's shoulder. Aldous turned and went back into the hall. He sat down at his desk. He pulled a fresh registration form from the top drawer. He uncapped the ink bottle. He squared the form on the desk, the way a man squares a thing when he means to take it seriously. At the top of the form, in his careful, even hand, he wrote, Vara of the Green Ash clan, first among healers, keeper of the old remedies, daughter of the matriarch Sura, permanent resident, practicing healer, date of arrival. He wrote the date. He set it on the left side of the desk, where it would be visible to anyone who came through the door. He pulled a second sheet and wrote, in the same hand, a formal notice of the Green Ash clan's gift and the intention to establish a joint healing post, which was the kind of thing that needed to be in the public record. He dated it and set it beside the first form. Then he pulled the old file, the original intake form from the autumn, the accumulated observations across a winter's worth of open case notes, and brought it up beside the new registration. He opened it to the last page, picked up his pen, and wrote in the margin in his most careful hand. 11 residents treated and recovered, winter of the early frost, a debt this town owes and intends to repay. He capped the ink bottle. He carried the new registration form to the door and held it out. She read it. She read the top line again, slowly, the way you read something you want to make sure you've read correctly. She looked up at him. I'll need the old file updated as well, she said. You can't just carry an intake form over to a permanent registration. There's a formal amendment procedure. I'm aware of that, he said. I've already pulled the form, come in out of the cold. She looked at him for a moment. And what was in her face was not the careful, measuring attention of the autumn, or even the warmth of the winter evenings, but something that included both of those and was also simpler, a recognition between 2 people who have been keeping each other's company with honesty for long enough that no presentation is required. She came in. He set the amendment form on the desk beside the rest. She sat down across from him. He uncapped the ink bottle. Full name and title, he said. For the permanent record. And behind them, through the open door, the market lane began to fill with sound voices, the horses shifting, the younger Wren boy asking his mother something in his high, clear voice. And then laughter from somewhere near the wagon of stone, one of the apprentices, a young woman, saying something that made the people nearest her laugh too. And then more voices, and the sound of Prosser coming out of his inn and asking somebody what exactly was going on, and the sound of somebody explaining it to him, and then Prosser being quiet in the particular way Prosser was quiet when he was recalculating something. Aldous Crane wrote her name at the top of the permanent record. All of it in full in his careful, even hand. Every word of the title she carried, the clan she came from, the name her mother had given her. He wrote it where everyone who came to the magistrate's hall on any morning of any season would be able to read it. He wrote it and left the file open. And in the margin at the bottom, under the note he had already made, he added one more line in the same careful hand. The chair is still here. He had never written anything like that in a margin before. He thought it was probably not enough. But it was, he decided, precisely accurate.